Unlocking Critical Thinking, 10 Essential Insights. Below is a freshly worded, easy-to-follow version of the original passage. The substance remains the same, but sentences are smoother, slightly expanded, and a bit more organized for newcomers to the topic. You are about to watch 10 brief video clips, each one runs under 2 minutes. Every clip revolves around the topic of critical thinking. Most of the questions featured in these recordings were directed to me while I was designing and teaching critical thinking courses at Bill State University, where I taught several years ago. All of the footage was originally uploaded to a now-defunct social platform called Voo. Voo encouraged users to respond to prompts by recording themselves on a webcam, so the production quality is modest, but the ideas are front and center. When I first discovered Voo, I invited my own students to experiment with it. I told them, if you want to explore how digital dialogue works, or if you simply have a burning question about critical thinking, record a short response on the site. Quite a few accepted the invitation. Out of the 10 clips you will see, I estimate that 6 or 7 come from my classes, the rest were submitted by other Voo users who happened to join the conversation. One of the recurring questions students asked is whether we should start teaching critical thinking at an early age. My answer is an unequivocal yes. In fact, if we don't intentionally cultivate these skills, we place children at a real disadvantage. I routinely meet college freshmen who are unfamiliar with concepts that students 20, 30, or 40 years ago would have learned by the end of high school. As a result, I have to devote considerable time to remedial instruction before we can tackle more advanced material. Why does this gap exist? Part of the problem is that many K-12 educators have an incomplete picture of what critical thinking entails. They often define it narrowly, as merely looking at an issue from multiple viewpoints or asking a few probing questions. Those activities are helpful, but they only scratch the surface. Sound critical thinking is deeply rooted in argument, constructing clear arguments, dissecting other people's arguments, and recognizing how evidence and reasoning fit together. Historically, being considered an educated person meant you had practiced studying argument after argument, learning to express your ideas coherently and follow complex lines of reasoning. Take Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, for example. The piece is not just eloquent, it is a tightly structured argument. King assumed his readers were equipped to detect claims, premises, and conclusions. Without that background, the letter can come across as a jumble of lofty sentiments rather than a persuasive call to action. Developing the ability to track such reasoning opens up an entire intellectual world, especially within the humanities, where analyzing texts, speeches, and artworks requires more than passive appreciation, it demands active, disciplined thought. For these reasons, critical thinking should be intentionally woven into the curriculum. At the moment, however, it rarely receives systematic attention. Whether that will change remains an open question, but I hope it does. Ideally, high schools would adopt a two-pronged approach. First, they could offer standalone modules or mini-courses devoted to argument analysis, logical fallacies, and evidence evaluation. Second, those same skills should be infused across subjects, English, history, even science, so students practice them in multiple contexts. When educators treat critical thinking as both a dedicated topic and an across-the-board habit of mind, students internalize it more thoroughly. Sadly, many professionals I meet in education circles use the term critical thinking but attach very different meanings to it. My goal, through these short clips and my teaching in general, is to clarify what the practice actually involves and why it matters so much, not only for academic success but also for informed citizenship and everyday problem solving. To truly grasp what philosophers mean by critical thinking, it's best to refer to the American Philosophical Association's Delphi report. In many other countries, what we call critical thinking is already integrated into their high school curricula. I believe we should follow suit, though it would require significant effort to implement. This need is evident because students entering my critical thinking classes are often unprepared, necessitating a lot of foundational work. A student recently asked if critical thinking is merely common sense. The answer is no. While they are interconnected, critical thinking extends beyond common sense. Critical thinking, as a discipline, involves studying argumentation, analyzing arguments by breaking them down, evaluating their quality, assessing the truth of premises, and evaluating information sources. It builds on common sense but goes further by employing specific methods that common sense lacks. Another insightful question was about the difference between critical thinking and common sense. Here are 3 key points. First, critical thinking builds on and codifies common sense, extending its reach. Without some common sense, critical thinking might not be as effective. Second, critical thinking can be taught through textbooks, techniques, and concepts, unlike common sense, which is more situational and habitual. Lastly, common sense can't explain itself, but critical thinking can provide reasons for its judgments. With common sense, you might make the right decisions but struggle to articulate why. Critical thinking, however, allows you to give clear reasons for your conclusions. When evaluating whether an argument is strong or weak, one must consider the presence of fallacies or the truthfulness of its premises. This process often requires more than just common sense, and I hope this explanation clarifies that point. A question posed by one of my students in a critical thinking course is whether it is more beneficial to be a skeptical thinker or a critical thinker. The answer to this question largely hinges on how one defines skepticism. There are two primary interpretations I would like to discuss. If by skeptical you mean actively seeking evidence that is appropriate to the claims being made, then this aligns closely with the principles of critical thinking. This approach should not only be applied to the arguments of others but also to your own thoughts and decisions. For instance, when you contemplate whether to pursue a particular action or refrain from it, a critical thinker will also question their own motivations and desires. This does not imply dismissing your feelings outright, rather, it involves seeking evidence and reasoning to support your thoughts. On the other hand, if skepticism is characterized by an unwavering disbelief in anything unless presented with impossibly high standards of evidence, then that is not a constructive form of skepticism. Such an attitude does not reflect critical thinking, and if this is what you mean by being a skeptical thinker, I would encourage you to embrace critical thinking instead. Now, you might be wondering what to do with the critical thinking skills you've acquired after completing my class. My hope is that you will continue to apply what you've learned, provided you have genuinely engaged with the material, something I find that only about a third of my students do each semester. You should aim to build upon the foundational skills we developed in class, integrating them into your toolkit for reasoning and analysis. Think of these skills as the framework of your thought process. Critical thinking encompasses various areas, such as constructing persuasive arguments, evaluating the arguments of others, assessing the credibility of information sources, and comparing different viewpoints. These are habits that require practice, they are not skills you simply master overnight. I encourage you to cultivate these abilities as part of your communication style and overall approach to life. I believe that developing these skills is crucial, and I can identify 4 key areas where critical thinking is especially important. First, in your academic pursuits, you will need to formulate arguments, analyze others' arguments, assess information sources, and engage in self-reflection to foster personal growth. Second, in the realm of politics, critical thinking is essential for making informed decisions. Third, as a consumer in the marketplace, you must apply critical thinking to navigate choices effectively. Lastly, in your personal life, many conflicts arise from misunderstandings that could be resolved through better reasoning and communication. A significant aspect of therapy involves therapists identifying and addressing errors in critical thinking made by their clients. This highlights the importance of critical thinking skills. As for students utilizing critical thinking after leaving my class, I have encountered several who have shared their experiences with me. For instance, they have mentioned applying concepts learned in my class to other courses, recognizing incomplete information in news reports, or analyzing advertisements before making purchasing decisions. These examples demonstrate that some students continue to use critical thinking skills beyond the classroom. In my role as an educator, I hope that all students continue to practice and build upon the critical thinking skills acquired in my classes. However, I recognize that many students may forget these skills after completing the course, which is unfortunate. Critical thinking is crucial for making informed decisions in various aspects of life, such as voting, consuming, and being productive members of society. Without these skills, individuals may inadvertently contribute to a marketplace that exploits others and become a problem for their fellow citizens and family members. Critical thinking can be considered a responsibility for educated individuals, which is why it is a required course at our university, although it is not universally mandated. One of my critical thinking students posed a valid question: how does critical thinking prepare us for the world outside of college? In my class, we cover various building blocks of arguments, including analysis, evaluation, information source assessment, bias recognition, informal fallacies, and inductive reasoning techniques. I emphasize the relevance of these skills to other courses, but the question remains, what is the practical application of critical thinking in the real world? To address this, I provide numerous real-life examples in my lectures, ranging from politics and products to personal relationships and stereotyping. Failures in critical thinking often lead to poor choices, flawed inferences, and heated arguments. By developing critical thinking skills, students can make better decisions, engage in more productive discussions, and contribute positively to society. In the discussion you are examining, it is essential to recognize that the argument may exist within a broader framework. I have just a few moments left to emphasize that critical thinking encompasses more than merely a collection of techniques or skills, it also involves certain dispositions. One of the key dispositions is the ability to consider the larger context and engage in self-reflection, which is fundamental to effective critical thinking. This skill is not only vital in academic settings but also plays a significant role in everyday life. Now, let's explore what constitutes a strong deductive argument. The answer is quite clear and straightforward. A good deductive argument is one that is both valid and sound. To clarify, valid refers to the argument's structural integrity. The beauty of deductive arguments lies in the fact that they can be evaluated based solely on their structure. This is the essence of formal logic. You can represent these arguments using various symbols, letters, or any other variables you prefer, allowing you to focus on their form. If the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion, then the argument is deemed valid. There are numerous techniques available for analyzing deductive arguments, which I find particularly fascinating. Many individuals in fields such as mathematics and computer science also share this interest. Unfortunately, due to time constraints in my critical thinking class, we were unable to delve into these techniques in detail. However, they offer intriguing methods for dissecting deductive reasoning. The second criterion for a good deductive argument is that it must be sound, meaning the premises must actually be true. Assessing the truth of these premises involves more than just examining their structure, it often requires looking at real-world evidence or comparing the claims made with your existing knowledge or expertise in a particular area. Thus, for an argument to be considered strong, it must fulfill both the validity and soundness criteria. One of the most thought-provoking questions I have encountered regarding critical thinking is whether composing music necessitates critical thinking skills. The answer is no. Writing music does not require the ability to construct arguments or differentiate between various claims, nor does it involve concerns about the credibility of information sources. However, to compose music effectively, one does need some of the same foundational dispositions associated with critical thinking. For instance, persistence is crucial. A composer must be willing to immerse themselves in the complexities of music. Understanding music theory often requires a grasp of mathematical concepts, as this knowledge aids in making sense of musical structures. Additionally, a successful composer must possess both a keen ear and a sharp intellect. Therefore, while critical thinking skills in the traditional sense may not be necessary for writing music, the process does demand qualities that are closely related to those skills.